The key was heavier than I expected. Cold iron, rough along the edges where someone had filed it down by hand. Grandfather's handwriting on the envelope said only Havenwood Farm. Nothing more. No instructions, no warnings, just the key and a memory of his voice, slow and careful, telling me once that land remembers longer than people do. I held it tighter as the bus turned off the highway. The road narrowed. Trees leaned in close, their branches forming tunnels of green shadow. Through the dusty window, I watched the landscape shift. Wide fields, old fences made of split rail, a barn painted red so long ago the color had faded to rust. It felt like driving backward through time. When the bus pulled into Havenwood, the driver didn't announce the stop. He just looked at me in the rearview mirror and nodded. I stepped down onto gravel. The air smelled clean. Pine and earth and something sweeter I couldn't name. The town square was small. A post office, a general store with a faded awning, a diner with checkered curtains in the window. A few people sat on benches near the fountain, talking quietly. One woman looked up as I passed, smiled, then looked away. I walked toward the general store. The bell above the door chimed softly. Inside, it was cool and dim. Shelves lined with canned goods, sacks of flour, jars of honey with handwritten labels. A radio played somewhere in the back, low and crackling. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 60s. Gray hair pinned nicely, wearing a floral apron. Her face was kind. "Afternoon," she said, her voice warm. "You just come in on the bus?" "Yes, ma'am." "Passing through or staying a while?" I set my bag down. "Staying. I inherited some property here, my grandfather's farm." Her smile didn't fade, but something in her eyes changed. A flicker, a pause. "Your grandfather?" she repeated slowly. "What was his name?" "Thomas Calloway." The warmth left her face like someone had drawn a curtain. She didn't move, didn't speak, just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not anger, not fear, but something close to both. Then she turned slightly as if listening to something I couldn't hear. "The Calloway place," she said quietly. "Yes. Is there something wrong with that?" She folded her hands on the counter, careful and deliberate. "No, nothing wrong. It's just that land's been empty a long time." 15 years? 15 years, she echoed. She looked down at her hands. "You planning to live there?" "I am." She nodded slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Well, you'll need supplies, I imagine. Candles, matches. The power's been off out there for some time." "I'll get it turned back on." "You can try." Her voice was soft, but not unkind. "Road out there's about 3 miles east. Follow the old fence line. You'll know it when you see it." I thanked her and picked up a few things. Bread, canned soup, a box of candles. When I went to pay, she didn't meet my eyes. "Be careful out there," she said. "Careful of what?" She didn't answer, just handed me my change and turned away. I left the store feeling heavier than when I'd entered. The walk out of town was quiet. A man on a porch stopped rocking in his chair to watch me pass. A woman pulling weeds from her garden glanced up, then quickly looked down again. I tried to smile at a boy on a bicycle, but he pedaled faster, disappearing around a corner. It was as if the whole town was holding its breath. The road stretched ahead, dusty and pale in the afternoon light. On either side, fields rolled out in long waves, golden and still. I could see the fence line the woman mentioned, weathered wood posts leaning at angles, wire sagging between them like old stitches. I followed it east. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows. My shoes scuffed against the gravel. The key in my pocket felt heavier with every step, as if it knew where it was going and was pulling me forward. Then I saw it. The farmhouse. It sat at the end of a dirt drive, framed by two tall pines. White clapboard siding, streaked gray with age, a porch that sagged slightly on one side, windows, dark and empty, staring out like tired eyes. Behind it, a barn leaned into the wind, its roof missing shingles, its doors half open. The land around it was quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no wind in the grass, just stillness. Thick and patient, like the earth was waiting for something. I walked up the porch steps. Each one creaked under my weight. The key slid into the lock easily, as if it had been oiled just yesterday. The door swung inward with a low groan. Inside, the air was cool and stale. Dust hung in the light coming through the windows. The furniture was still there, a couch draped with a faded quilt, a table with two chairs, a clock on the mantel that had stopped at 3:17. Everything looked like someone had just stepped out and never came back. I set my bag down on the floor. The house was silent, but it didn't feel empty. I walked through the room slowly, running my hand along the walls. In the kitchen, I found a cup still sitting by the sink. In the bedroom, the bed was made, the corners tucked tight. On the nightstand, a pair of reading glasses lay folded beside a book with no title on the spine. It was my grandfather's house, but it felt like someone else's memory. I returned to the porch and sat on the top step, looking out over the fields. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The land stretched out before me, beautiful and strange. And somewhere beneath all that beauty was the reason the woman in the store had looked at me the way she did. The reason no one in town would meet my eyes. I didn't know what it was yet, but I could feel it, heavy and patient, like the key in my hand. Something was buried here. Something the town remembered. Something they wanted to stay forgotten. And I was standing right on top of it. The first 3 days passed slowly. I woke with the sun, made coffee on the old stove after I got the gas line working, sat on the porch and watched the mist rise from the fields like breath. The land was bigger than I'd imagined, acre after acre rolling out toward the tree line, broken only by the occasional fence post or stone. I walked it every morning, not with any plan, just walking, feeling the ground under my feet, trying to understand what my grandfather had loved about this place. The silence was the first thing I noticed. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that made you aware of your own heartbeat. No cars passed on the road, no planes overhead. Even the birds seemed fewer here, their calls distant and cautious. It was as if the land itself was listening, waiting to see what I would do. On the fourth morning, I saw him. An old man standing on the other side of the fence that separated our properties. He wore a faded denim shirt and a straw hat pulled low. His hands rested on the top rail, and he was watching me the way you watch a storm coming in from the west, wary but not surprised. I stopped walking. He didn't move. Finally, I crossed the field toward him. The grass was tall, wet with dew, soaking the cuffs of my jeans. When I got close enough, I could see his face, deeply lined, weathered like old leather, eyes pale blue and sharp. "Morning?" He nodded once. "Morning." His voice was rough, like gravel rolling in a tin can. "I'm staying at the Calloway place. Just moved in a few days ago." "I know." Of course he did. In a town this small, everyone knew. I offered my hand over the fence. "I'm Jamie Calloway." He looked at my hand for a long moment before taking it. His grip was firm, calloused. "Silas March, I'm your neighbor." "Good to meet you." He let go and returned his hands to the rail. His eyes drifted past me toward the farmhouse in the distance, then further east toward the far edge of my property where the old oak tree stood alone in the field. "You been out there yet?" he asked. "Out where?" "The eastern field, near the big oak." I shook my head. "Not yet. I've mostly stuck close to the house." Something in his expression shifted. Not relief, exactly. More like approval. "Good," he said quietly. "Keep it that way." I frowned. "Why?" Silas pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his forehead, slow and deliberate. He didn't look at me when he spoke. "That part of the land, it's troubled." "Troubled? How?" "Just is." He folded the handkerchief and tucked it away. "Your grandfather knew it, kept his distance. You'd do well to do the same." I crossed my arms. "I don't believe in curses, if that's what you're getting at." "Didn't say curse. Said troubled. There's a difference." "Then what's the trouble?" He was quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the grass, soft and slow. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called out sharp and lonely. Finally, Silas spoke. "Livestock used to graze that field. Sheep, mostly. Sometimes cattle. But they'd get sick. Not all of them, just the ones that wandered too close to the oak. They'd stop eating, stand still for hours, staring at nothing. Some of them died. Others, they'd run, break through fences, hurt themselves trying to get away from something we couldn't see. I felt the chill run down my spine, though the morning was warm. That's why no one grazes there now. Hasn't been an animal in that field for near 30 years, maybe more. Did anyone ever figure out why? Some said bad water. Others thought maybe the roots were poisonous. But the creek runs clean, and there's nothing wrong with the soil. He looked at me then, his pale eyes steady. "It's not the land that's sick. It's what's in it." "What do you mean?" Silas turned away, looking out over his own fields. "There's a sadness there. I can't explain it better than that. You go out there, you feel it, like the ground itself is grieving." I wanted to argue, wanted to say it was just superstition, old fears passed down and never questioned, but something in the way he spoke, so calm, so certain, made me hesitate. "Did my grandfather ever talk to you about it?" I asked. Silas shook his head. "Thomas wasn't much for talking, kept to himself mostly. But I saw him out there once, years ago, just standing by the oak. Didn't move for near an hour. When he came back, his face..." He paused, searching for the words. He looked like a man carrying something heavy, something he couldn't set down. The image settled over me like a shadow. "I'm not telling you what to do," Silas pushed off from the fence. "It's your land, you can do what you like with it. But if you're smart, you'll leave that field alone. Stay close to the house, work the land that wants to be worked." He turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at me. "Your grandfather was a good man, But even good men have regrets. And then he walked away, slow and steady, his boots crunching softly in the grass. I stood there for a long time, staring out toward the eastern field. The oak tree rose above the grass like a dark sentinel, its branches twisted and bare, even though it was summer. The land around it looked the same as everywhere else, green and open and ordinary. But Silas's words lingered, a sadness in the soil. I told myself I didn't believe it, told myself I'd walk that field tomorrow just to prove there was nothing there. But even as I thought it, I felt something inside me hesitate, something that sounded a lot like fear. I turned back toward the house, the morning sun warm on my shoulders. Behind me, the oak tree stood alone, silent and waiting. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me go. I told myself I'd wait, give it a few more days, settle in, fix the porch railing, clear the weeds from the garden. There were 100 things that needed doing, and walking out to that field wasn't one of them. But Silas's words stayed with me. A sadness in the soil. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't stop looking out the kitchen window toward the eastern field where the oak tree stood dark against the sky. Every time I tried to focus on something else, my eyes would drift back. On the 5th morning, I stopped pretending. I laced up my boots, pulled on my grandfather's old work jacket, still hanging by the door like he'd be back for it, and walked out into the field. The grass was tall here, unmowed for years. It reached my knees in some places, swaying gently in the breeze. The air smelled of earth and wild clover. Overhead, the sky was clear and bright, the kind of blue that made everything feel clean. Nothing about it felt wrong. I walked slowly, deliberately, waiting for some sign of what Silas had warned me about, the sadness, the sickness in the land. But all I felt was the sun on my shoulders and the soft crunch of grass beneath my feet. The oak tree grew larger as I approached. It was massive, older than the farmhouse, older than the town maybe. Its trunk was thick and gnarled, the bark split and scarred by decades of weather. The branches stretched out wide and low, heavy with age, casting a broad shadow over the ground below. But there were no leaves, not one. In the middle of summer, the tree stood bare, like it was trapped in a permanent winter. I stopped at the edge of its shadow and looked up. The branches were twisted, reaching toward the sky like hands frozen mid-gesture. I stepped closer. The air beneath the tree was cooler, not unpleasant, but noticeable, like stepping into a cellar. The grass here was thinner, pale and brittle, as if the tree took more than just water from the soil. I walked around the trunk slowly, running my hand along the rough bark. There were carvings here and there, initials, dates, the kind of marks people leave when they want to be remembered. But they were old, faded, barely visible. Then my foot hit something. Hard, unmoving. I stumbled slightly, catching myself against the trunk. Looking down, I saw only grass. But when I crouched and pushed the blades aside, my fingers touched stone. Cold, flat, smooth. I pulled more grass away, working carefully, feeling the edges. It was a single stone, roughly rectangular, about the size of a book. Not like the other rocks scattered across the field. Those were round, weathered, the kind that rose up through the soil over time. This one was different. It had been placed. I cleared more grass, my hands moving faster now. The stone was half buried, its surface level with the ground, hidden beneath years of growth. I brushed away the dirt, revealing more of it. The edges were clean, deliberately cut. But there were no markings, no name, no date, nothing carved or etched into the surface. Just stone, silent and smooth. I sat back on my heels, staring at it. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. There was no reason for it, just a stone, just a rock someone had left here, maybe as a boundary marker or a footstone for something long forgotten. But it didn't feel like that. It felt deliberate, purposeful. It felt like a grave. I reached out and touched it again, running my fingers over the surface. The stone was cold, even in the sunlight, colder than it should have been. And beneath my hand, I could feel something, not a texture exactly, but a weight, a heaviness that seemed to press up from below, a sadness in the soil. Silas's words echoed in my mind. I pulled my hand back. The wind moved through the grass around me, but here, beneath the oak, the air was still. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick, could feel the pulse in my throat. I stood up slowly, backing away from the stone. My eyes stayed fixed on it, half expecting it to shift, to sink deeper, to reveal something I wasn't ready to see. But it didn't move. It just sat there, quiet and patient, like it had been waiting for a long time. I turned and walked back toward the house, faster than I intended. The sunlight felt warmer the further I got from the tree. The grass seemed greener, the air lighter. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd found something I wasn't supposed to. Back on the porch, I sat down heavily, pulling off my boots. My hands were still dirty from clearing the grass, soil under my nails. I stared out at the field, at the oak tree standing alone in the distance. From here, you couldn't see the stone, couldn't tell there was anything unusual about that spot at all. But I knew, and now I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who had placed it there? And why leave it unmarked? If it was a grave, where was the name? Where was the memory? And if it wasn't a grave, then what was it marking? I thought about my grandfather, about the way he'd kept his distance from that field, according to Silas, and the journal entries I'd found inside, years of careful notes, detailed and precise, except for one summer, one gap, one silence. I didn't have answers yet, but I had a feeling they were all connected. The stone, the tree, the silence in the town, the way people looked at me when I said where I was staying. Something had happened here. Something no one wanted to talk about. And whatever it was buried under that tree. I looked down at my hands. They were still trembling, just slightly. Not from fear, not exactly. From recognition. The feeling I'd had when I touched that stone, that heaviness, that weight, pressing up from below, it wasn't unfamiliar. It felt like grief. Old grief. The kind that doesn't fade. The kind that seeps into the ground and stays there, waiting. I stood up and went inside, closing the door behind me. But I didn't lock it, because part of me knew I'd be going back. The stone stayed in my mind. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, flat and gray, hidden beneath the grass. I kept thinking about the weight of it, the silence. The next morning, I decided I needed answers, and if the town wouldn't give them to me, maybe the house would. The attic was my first stop. It was hot and smelled of dry wood and dust. Sunlight slanted through a single round window, illuminating dancing particles of dust. Cardboard boxes, old trunks, and furniture draped in white sheets filled the space, a crowded graveyard of my grandfather's life. I spent hours up there, going through everything. Old tax records, faded photographs of people I didn't recognize, a box of his army medals, but nothing about the farm, nothing about the land. Discouraged, I came back downstairs. I made a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty wall. My eyes fell on the bookshelf in the living room. It was filled with old paperbacks, farmers' almanacs, and a neat row of identical leather-bound books. The journals. I hadn't looked at them properly yet. I'd flipped through one or two, but now I felt a pull toward them, a sense that the answer I was looking for was right there. I pulled one from the shelf. 1955 was embossed in gold on the spine. I opened it. My grandfather's handwriting was small and neat, each line filled with the details of his days. He wrote about the weather, the price of feed, the birth of a calf, the first frost of winter. His words were simple, but they painted a beautiful picture of a life lived in rhythm with the land. He wrote with a quiet love for this place. I went through them one by one. 1956, 1957. Each page filled, each season documented. I read about his struggles with drought, his satisfaction with a good harvest, the quiet joy of a snowy morning. He wrote about fixing the barn roof, mending fences, the day he bought a new tractor. It was all there. Then I picked up the next volume, 1958. I opened it. The first page was blank. I frowned and turned it. Blank. Another. Blank. Page after page. Nothing. I flipped forward. The entire section for June was empty. July, the same. August. The pages were pristine, untouched. Not ink, no words, not even a stray mark. It wasn't that he'd run out of things to say. It was that he had deliberately left them empty. Then, on the first page of September, the entries started again. Mended the fence by the creek, it read. The handwriting was shakier than before, but it was his. The entries continued from there, back to normal, describing the harvest, the turning leaves, the coming cold. But that summer, the summer of 1958, was a void. A perfect silent hole in the middle of 20 years of daily entries. I sat back in my chair, the open book in my lap. The silence of the empty pages was louder than any words could have been. Something happened that summer. Something so profound, so terrible that it had stolen my grandfather's words. I thought of the stone under the oak tree, the way Silas had talked about the trouble in that field, the sickness that had no name. Had it started that summer? I closed the book. The house felt colder now despite the sun outside. The quiet rooms seemed to hold a new kind of silence, not just emptiness, but absence. The town knew. Silas knew. And my grandfather, he knew. He just couldn't bring himself to write it down. I had to find out what happened. I had to give that silence a voice. And I had a feeling my search would have to start outside the walls of this farm. It was time to go back to town. The drive to town felt different this time. The quiet fields and leaning fences no longer looked peaceful. They looked secretive. The Havenwood Town Archives were housed in the back of the library, a small, stuffy room that smelled of old paper and lemon polish. Shelves packed with leather-bound ledgers and cardboard boxes stretched to the ceiling. A single wooden table sat in the center, a pool of light falling on it from an overhead lamp. A woman sat at a small desk in the corner, her spectacles perched on her nose. She looked up when I entered, her expression kind but weary. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I hope so. My name is Jamie Calloway. I'm looking for some old records for my grandfather's farm." Her friendly expression tightened just for a second. It was the same reaction I'd seen all over town. The Calloway place. Yes. What sort of records were you looking for? Property maps mostly? Maybe some land deeds or ownership records? I'm trying to piece together a history of the property. She nodded slowly. Of course. The county records are all here. She led me to a large metal cabinet. The maps are filed by year. Do you have a specific time period in mind? Let's start with the 1950s. Maybe 1957? She pulled out a long, shallow drawer. Here we are. She carefully unrolled a large, brittle map on the table. It was a detailed drawing of the entire county, properties marked out with neat black lines. She pointed to a section on the eastern edge of town. Here's the Callaway farm. I leaned in, tracing the lines with my finger. The farmhouse, the barn, the fields, it was all there. I looked at the eastern field where the oak tree stood. It was just an empty square on the map. Nothing marked, nothing noted. Do you have the map for 1958? The archivist Eleanor hesitated. 1958. She went back to the cabinet and pulled on a drawer. It didn't open. She pulled again, harder. It seems to be stuck. Can I help? No. Her voice was a little too bright. She moved to the next drawer down. Let's see. 1959 is here. She pulled it out and unrolled it. It looked identical to the 1957 map. What about 1958? I repeated. Eleanor avoided my eyes. She busied herself with re-rolling the 1959 map, her movements fussy and agitated. A flood, I said flatly. That's convenient. She flinched. I beg your pardon? It seems to be the one year I'm most interested in. The summer of 1958. Does that year mean anything to you? Eleanor went pale. She dropped the map on the table, the ribbon falling from her shaking fingers. She took a step back from the table. From me. I don't know what you're talking about. She stammered. It was just a flood. These things happen in old buildings. She was lying. The fear in her eyes was real. It was the same fear I'd seen in the woman at the general store, the same unease I'd heard in Silas's voice. A shared, unspoken secret that the whole town was conspiring to keep buried. Is there anything else? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Any other years you'd like to see? I knew it was pointless. Whatever she was hiding, she wouldn't give it up easily. No, I said quietly. That's all for today. I turned and walked out of the archives, leaving her standing there, a small, frightened woman in a room full of other people's histories. The history of my own family was here, somewhere, but it was being deliberately kept from me. Walking back to my car, I felt a new sense of resolve. It wasn't just about a stone under a tree anymore. It wasn't just about my grandfather's empty journal. It was about a lie. A lie so old and so deep that the entire town had conspired to keep it buried. They could hide the maps, they could pretend not to know, but the land remembered, and I was living on it. The drive to town felt different this time. The quiet fields and leaning fences no longer looked peaceful. They looked secretive. The Havenwood Town Archives were housed in the back of the library, a small, stuffy room that smelled of old paper and lemon polish. Shelves packed with leather-bound ledgers and cardboard boxes stretched to the ceiling. A single wooden table sat in the center, a pool of light falling on it from an overhead lamp. A woman sat at a small desk in the corner, spectacles perched on her nose. She looked up when I entered, her expression kind but weary. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I hope so. My name is Jamie Calloway. I'm looking for some old records from my grandfather's farm." Her friendly expression tightened, just for a second. It was the same reaction I'd seen all over town. "The Calloway place? Yes. What sort of records were you looking for?" "Property maps, mostly. Maybe some land deeds or ownership records. I'm trying to piece together a history of the property." She nodded slowly. "Of course. The county records are all here." She led me to a large metal cabinet. "The maps are filed by year. Do you have a specific time period in mind? Let's start with the 1950s, I said. Maybe 1957? She pulled out a long, shallow drawer. Here we are. She carefully unrolled a large, brittle map on the table. It was a detailed drawing of the entire county, properties marked out with neat black lines. She pointed to a section on the eastern edge of town. Here's the Callaway farm. I leaned in, tracing the lines with my finger. The farmhouse, the barn, the fields, it was all there. I looked at the eastern field where the oak tree stood. It was just an empty square on the map. Nothing marked, nothing noted. Do you have the map for 1958? I asked. The archivist, Eleanor, hesitated. 1958. She went back to the cabinet and pulled on a drawer. It didn't open. She pulled again, harder. It seems to be stuck. Can I help? No. Her voice was a little too bright. She moved to the next drawer down. Let's see. 1959 is here. She pulled it out and unrolled it. It looked identical to the 1957 map. What about 1958? I repeated. Eleanor avoided my eyes. She busied herself with re-rolling the 1959 map, her movements fussy and agitated. I'm afraid that one's missing. We had a small flood in the basement storage room back in the 80s. A few of the older records were damaged. The 1958 map was one of them, I believe. She wasn't looking at me. Her hands were trembling slightly as she tried to tie the ribbon around the map. A flood, I said flatly. That's convenient. She flinched. Excuse me? It seems to be the one year I'm most interested in. The summer of 1958. Does that year mean anything to you? Eleanor went pale. She dropped the map on the table, the ribbon falling from her shaking fingers. She took a step back from the table, from me. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered. It was just a flood. These things happen in old buildings. She was lying. The fear in her eyes was real. It was the same fear I'd seen in the woman at the general store, the same unease I'd heard in Silas's voice. A shared, unspoken secret that the whole town was conspiring to keep buried. Is there anything else? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Any other years you'd like to see? I knew it was pointless. Whatever she was hiding, she wouldn't give it up easily. No, I said quietly. That's all for today. I turned and walked out of the archives, leaving her standing there, a small, frightened woman in a room full of other people's histories. The history of my own family was here, somewhere, but it was being deliberately kept from me. Walking back to my car, I felt a new sense of resolve. It wasn't just about a stone under a tree anymore. It wasn't just about my grandfather's empty journal. It was about a lie. A lie so old and so deep that the entire town had conspired to keep buried. They could hide the maps. They could pretend not to know. But the land remembered. And I was living on it. The storm came in from the west just before sunset. I watched it roll across the fields from the porch, a wall of dark clouds moving slow and deliberate, swallowing the sky. The wind picked up, bending the tall grass in waves. Thunder rumbled, low and distant, like something ancient waking up. I should have gone inside, but something held me there, watching the first drops fall. They came softly at first, then harder, drumming against the porch roof, turning the dirt road to mud. The smell of rain on dry earth filled the air, rich and dark and alive. And then I felt it. A pull. Not physical. Something deeper. Like a voice calling from across the fields, though there was no sound but the rain. I stepped off the porch. The rain soaked through my shirt almost immediately, cold against my skin. But I didn't stop. I walked across the yard, through the gate, into the eastern field. The grass was slick beneath my boots, the ground soft and yielding. The oak tree stood ahead, its bare branches black against the bruised sky. I walked toward it, Rain streaming down my face, blurring my vision. Lightning flashed, brief and bright, illuminating everything for a split second. The twisted branches, the pale grass, the stone, the unmarked stone. I knelt beside it, my knees sinking into the wet earth. The rain hammered down, washing over the surface of the stone, cleaning away years of dirt and moss. In the dim, shifting light, I could see it more clearly than I had before. And that's when I noticed something, a shadow, a texture, something carved into the underside edge of the stone where it met the soil. I ran my fingers along the surface, feeling for it. There, faint, almost invisible, worn smooth by time and weather. Letters, carved shallow and small, as if whomever had done it hadn't wanted them to be easily found. I traced them with my fingertip, spelling them out, one by one. L, Y, D, I, A. Lydia. The name settled over me like a weight. I sat back on my heels, staring at the stone, rain pouring down around me. The thunder rolled overhead, closer now, shaking the ground. Lydia. Not a marker, not a monument, just a name, hidden and quiet, carved into the underside edge of the stone that no one was supposed to notice. Who was she? I thought of the town's silence, the missing map, my grandfather's empty journal pages, the sadness Silas had spoken of, buried in the soil. This wasn't just an unmarked grave. This was a secret grave. Someone had been buried here, deliberately forgotten, her name hidden where only someone looking, really looking, would ever find it. And judging by the way the town reacted to any mention of this place, they had all agreed to let her stay forgotten. But why? What had she done? Or what had been done to her? I pressed my hand against the cold stone, feeling the letters beneath my palm. The rain poured harder, pooling around the base of the tree, soaking into the ground. The earth here was soft, saturated, as if it had been waiting for this, as if the rain was finally giving it permission to weep. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief moment of light, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. The ground around the stone was different, sunken just slightly. The grass grew thinner here, paler. It was the kind of settling that happens when soil has been disturbed, when something has been buried and the earth slowly reclaims the space. A grave. This was a grave, and Lydia was in it. I stood up slowly, water streaming from my clothes, my hair plastered to my face. The storm raged around me, but I barely felt it. All I could think about was the woman beneath my feet, the woman whose name had been carved in secret, the woman the town had buried twice, once in the earth and once in silence. I needed to know who she was. I needed to know why her name was a secret. The rain began to ease, the storm moving past, leaving the world soaked and breathless. I walked back to the house slowly, my boots heavy with mud. The porch light glowed warm in the dusk, but the house felt different now, less like a shelter and more like a guardian of secrets. Inside, I stripped off my wet clothes and stood in front of the fireplace, shivering. But the cold I felt wasn't from the rain. It was deeper, colder. It was the cold of understanding.
My grandfather knew. He knew about Lydia, about the grave, about what the town wanted to forget. And he kept the secret, locked it away in empty journal pages and silent years. But he had also left me the farm. He had left me the key. Maybe he wanted me to find her. Maybe after all those years of silence, he wanted someone to finally say her name out loud. I walked to the window and looked out at the darkening field. The oak tree was just a silhouette now, barely visible against the night sky, but I knew it was there, and I knew what lay beneath it. Lydia. I whispered her name just once into the quiet room. It felt like breaking a spell. Tomorrow, I would go back to town. I would find out who she was. I would uncover the story they had buried with her, and I would give her what she deserved.
I didn't sleep that night. The name stayed with me, Lydia. I whispered it in the dark, testing it, as if saying it enough times would bring her closer, would make her real. By dawn, I knew what I had to do. I had to find out who she was. The drive to town felt longer this time. The fields looked different in the morning light. Softer, sadder, like they were mourning something I was only beginning to understand. When I walked into the archives, Eleanor was already there, sorting through a stack of papers at her desk. She looked up when the door opened, and the color drained from her face. "You," she said quietly. "Me," I replied. I didn't smile. "I need your help, Eleanor." She set the papers down carefully, her hands trembling. "I've already told you everything I can." "No," I interrupted, walking to her desk. "You haven't. You've told me lies. The map wasn't lost in a flood. The year 1958 wasn't an accident, and you know it." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked away. "I found a name," I said, "carved into a stone under the oak tree on my grandfather's property. Lydia. Do you know who she was?" Eleanor's breath caught, just for a second, but it was enough. "Please," I said, softer now. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to know the truth. She deserves that much." Eleanor closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet. "What do you need?" she whispered. "Birth records, death records, anything you can find on a woman named Lydia, last name unknown, probably born sometime in the late 30s or early 40s. Eleanor nodded slowly. She stood and walked to the filing cabinets, moving like someone walking through deep water. She pulled open a drawer marked Vital Records, 1930 to 1950. We searched together in silence. It took nearly an hour, but finally, Eleanor's hand stopped on a yellowed document. She pulled it out carefully, as if it might crumble. "Here," she said. I took it from her. It was a birth certificate, faded but legible. The ink was brown with age, but the words were clear. Name, Lydia May. Date of birth, June 14th, 1939. Place of birth, Havenwood, County General. Father, Robert Whitman. Mother, Catherine Whitman, named Fisher. I stared at the name, Lydia May, born right here, in this town. A real person with parents, with a birthday, not just a ghost beneath the ground. "Whitman," I said out loud. "Do you know that family?" Eleanor shook her head. "They left town long ago, before I was born, but I've heard the name mentioned." Quietly. "What happened to them?" She didn't answer. "Eleanor." "I don't know," she said, but her voice cracked. "No one talks about it." I looked back at the certificate in my hand. June 14th, 1939. She would have been only 18 in 1957. Just a girl. "What about marriage records?" I asked. "Maybe she got married, changed her name." Eleanor retrieved another ledger. We searched through it together, but there was no record of Lydia May Whitman ever marrying, no record of her leaving town, no record of her dying. It was as if, after 1957, she simply ceased to exist. But I knew better. She hadn't ceased to exist. She'd been erased, deliberately, carefully, by people who wanted to protect something or someone. And my grandfather had been one of them. I looked at Eleanor. Do you know who she was close to? Friends? Family? Anyone who might have known her? Eleanor hesitated. Then she said, very quietly, there was a photograph in the old town hall records from the summer fair in 1957. She was in it, standing next to. She stopped. Standing next to who? Eleanor looked away. Your grandfather. The words landed like a stone in water. Ripples spread outward, touching everything. I thought of the photograph I'd found in the barn. The one with Lydia, summer 57, written on the back in my grandfather's hand. They had known each other. More than that, they had been close. And then she had vanished. And he had stopped writing. I folded the birth certificate carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Thank you, Eleanor, I said. She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. I walked out of the archives into the bright morning sun, but the light felt harsh now, unforgiving. Lydia May Whitman had been born in 1939. She had lived in this town. She had loved or been loved by my grandfather. And then in the summer of 1957, she had disappeared. Not officially, not legally, just gone. Buried under an oak tree with no name, no record, no memory. Until now.
I'd been avoiding the barn. There was no good reason for it. It needed work. The roof was missing shingles, the doors hung crooked on their hinges, and years of weather had left the wood warped and gray. But every time I thought about going in there, something stopped me. Maybe it was the way it leaned into the wind, like it was tired of standing, or maybe it was the silence that lived inside it. But after finding Lydia's name, after learning she'd vanished without a trace, I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. If there were answers, they might be hiding in the places my grandfather had left untouched. So, on a cool, clear morning, I walked across the yard to the barn. The doors groaned when I pushed them open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of old wood and rust. Sunlight slanted through the gaps in the roof, illuminating floating particles like snow falling in reverse. The barn was cluttered. Old farm equipment lined the walls, rusted plows, broken harnesses, tools I didn't recognize. In the corner, stacks of wooden crates sat covered in dirt and cobwebs. Everything looked like it had been left exactly where it fell, frozen in time. I started with the crates, pulling them out one by one, opening them carefully. Most were empty or filled with useless junk, bent nails, scraps of wire, empty jars. But in the third crate, I found something different. A toolbox. It was old, the metal rusted at the edges, the latch stiff with age. I pried it open. Inside were the usual things: a hammer, a set of wrenches, a tape measure. But tucked into the corner, beneath a layer of oily rags, was something that didn't belong. A photograph. Small, square. The edges were worn soft, the corners bent from being folded and unfolded too many times. I picked it up carefully, as if it might disintegrate in my hands. The image was faded, but clear. A young woman stood in a field of tall grass, smiling at the camera. She wore a simple summer dress, white with small flowers, her hair loose and caught in the breeze. She was beautiful, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet, unguarded way of someone who didn't know they were being watched. Beside her stood a man, younger than I'd ever seen him, but unmistakable. My grandfather. His arm was around her shoulders. He was smiling too, looking at her instead of the camera. It was a smile I'd never seen in any other photograph. Open, unguarded, full of something I could only call joy. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in my grandfather's familiar handwriting, were 3 words. Lydia, summer of '57. I stared at the words until they blurred. Summer of 1957. The year before she disappeared. The year before the blank pages in his journal. The year before the town agreed to forget. This wasn't just a picture of 2 people standing together. This was evidence of something deeper, something the town had buried along with her body. My grandfather had loved her. I sat down on an overturned crate, still holding the photograph. The barn felt colder now, the silence heavier. I looked at the image again, at the way he looked at her, at the way she smiled, like she didn't know what was coming. What had happened between this moment and the summer of 1958? Why would he hide this photograph in a toolbox, tucked away in a barn he never went into? Unless he couldn't bear to throw it away. Unless he needed to keep her close, even if no one could know. I thought of the unmarked stone, the hidden name, the birth certificate with no matching death record, the town's fear, Eleanor's trembling hands, Silas's warning, and now this, proof that my grandfather knew her, had cared for her, maybe even loved her. But if he loved her, why was she buried in an unmarked grave? Why hadn't he given her a proper funeral, a headstone, a place in the town cemetery? Unless he couldn't. Unless something had happened that made it impossible. My mind raced through possibilities, each one darker than the last. An accident? A secret? A mistake? Or something worse? I stood up, slipping the photograph into my jacket pocket. I couldn't leave it here, hidden in the dark. She deserved better than that. They both did. I walked back to the house slowly, the photograph pressing against my chest like a heartbeat. Inside, I placed it carefully on the kitchen table and made coffee, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind turned over the pieces of the puzzle. Lydia Mae Whitman, born 1939, disappeared in the summer of 1957 or 58, no death record, no grave marker, just a stone with her name carved underneath an oak tree on my grandfather's land, and a photograph of him with her, smiling before everything fell apart. I picked up the photograph again, studying their faces. They looked happy, safe, like they believed the world was kind. But the world hadn't been kind. Whatever had happened to Lydia, it had destroyed her. And it had broken my grandfather too. Broken him so completely that he couldn't even write about it, couldn't speak her name, couldn't give her the dignity of being remembered. But I could. I would find out what happened. I would piece together the story the town had tried to erase. I would give Lydia Mae Whitman the memorial she deserved, even if it meant uncovering truths that my grandfather had spent his whole life trying to bury.
I looked out the window toward the eastern field. The oak tree stood alone, its bare branches reaching toward the sky like hands asking for forgiveness. "I'm going to find out," I whispered. And for the first time since I'd arrived, the house didn't feel so heavy. It felt like it was listening, like it was waiting, like it was finally ready to tell me the truth. The photograph felt like fire in my pocket as I walked across the fields towards Silas's property. I'd waited 3 days, trying to find the courage, trying to decide what to say. But every time I looked at that picture, at Lydia's smile, at my grandfather's open face, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. Silas was in his garden when I arrived, working a hoe between rows of beans. He didn't look up when I opened his gate, but I knew he'd heard me. "Silas?" I called. He kept working. The blade bit into the soil with steady, rhythmic strikes. "I need to talk to you." "Figured you would," he said quietly. "Eventually." I walked closer, stopping at the edge of the garden. I found something, in my grandfather's barn. Finally, he stopped. He leaned on the hoe, his shoulders sagging. He still wouldn't look at me. "I know who she was, Lydia Mae Whitman. I know she worked on the farm. I know she and my grandfather were close." Silas closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were red-rimmed and tired. "You should leave it alone," he whispered. "I can't. You should. She's buried on my land, Silas, with no name, no record. The whole town pretends she never existed. I can't just leave it alone." He turned to face me then, and the weight in his expression nearly broke me. It was the look of a man who'd been carrying something too heavy for too long. "Come inside," he said. "If you're going to hear it, you're going to hear all of it." We sat at his kitchen table. He made coffee with shaking hands, set a cup in front of me, and sat down across from me like a man preparing for confession. "Your grandfather was a good man," Silas began. "Best man I ever knew. But he made a mistake. We all did." I didn't speak. I just waited. Lydia came to work on the farm in the spring of '57. She needed the money. Her family was struggling, and she was strong. Capable. Thomas hired her on the spot. He was only 18. 18. Just a girl. They worked together all that summer, and somewhere along the way, they fell in love. Not the kind of love people talked about in church, the quiet kind, the real kind. "Why didn't they just get married?" I asked. Silas's laugh was bitter. "Because this town had rules. Unspoken ones, but rules all the same. Thomas was 42, Lydia was 18, her father was a drunk, her family had a bad name. People talked, said she was chasing money, said Thomas should know better." I felt a cold anger rising in my chest. So what? They loved each other. What did it matter what people thought? "It mattered," Silas said sharply. "It mattered because small towns have long memories and short patience. The more people talked, the worse it got. The church got involved, her family forbade her from seeing him, but they kept meeting anyway, in secret." He took a long breath. "Then, in August of '58, there was an accident." The word hung in the air like smoke. "What kind of accident?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Farm machinery. A thresher." His voice cracked. "She was working late one evening, trying to finish before dark. Thomas was in the barn. No one saw what happened, but when he came out and found her, he stopped. His hands were trembling so badly, he had to set down his cup. She was gone. Instantly. Nothing anyone could have done. I felt the air leave my lungs. Why didn't they report it? Why didn't they call the sheriff? Give her a proper funeral? Silas looked at me with hollow eyes. Because Thomas panicked. Because he knew what would happen. The town already disapproved of them. If it came out that she died on his farm, working for him, people would ask questions. They'd say he'd been careless, or worse. They'd say he'd hurt her deliberately. That's insane. That's small-town justice, Silas said bitterly. Thomas went to the sheriff, told him what happened. The sheriff went to the mayor went to the church, and they all agreed it was better to keep it quiet. Better for Thomas, better for the town, better for everyone. Better for everyone, I repeated, my voice rising. She was a person. She deserved. I know, Silas shouted, slamming his hand on the table. His voice broke. I know what she deserved. We all knew, but we did it anyway. The silence that followed was unbearable. Her family was paid off, Silas said quietly. Not much. Enough to leave town and start over somewhere else. They left within a week. And Thomas, he buried her himself, under the oak tree. At night. Alone. I thought of my grandfather, digging in the dark, the weight of the soil, the weight of the silence. He carved her name on the stone, Silas continued, but he did it underneath, where no one would see, because even then he couldn't let her go completely. He needed to mark her, to remember. I pulled the photograph from my pocket and set it on the table. This was her, wasn't it? Silas looked at the picture and his face crumpled. Yes, that's Lydia. He loved her. He did, and it destroyed him. Silas wiped his eyes. He stopped talking after that, stopped going to church, stopped seeing people. He just disappeared into that farm, and the town let him, because we were all complicit. We all kept the secret. I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. You buried her twice, once in the ground and once in silence. I know, Silas whispered, and I've lived with that guilt. I couldn't stop thinking about what Silas had told me. The accident, the cover-up, the way an entire town had conspired to erase a young woman from history. And my grandfather, the man I'd thought I knew, had been at the center of it all. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with his journals spread before me, all 20 volumes, leather-bound and worn, containing 2 decades of his life. I'd read through them before, but now I looked at them differently. I picked up the 1958 volume again, the one with the blank pages. I opened it slowly, running my hand over the empty sheets. June, July, August, all silent. Then September, where the entries began again. But this time, something caught my eye. The back cover sat slightly higher than it should have, as if something was tucked beneath the lining. I turned the book over and examined it more closely. The leather backing had come loose at one corner, creating a small gap. I slid my finger inside and felt something. Paper. My heart began to race. I worked carefully, pulling at the corner until the lining peeled back enough for me to reach inside. There, pressed flat against the cardboard backing, was a single folded page. I pulled it out with trembling hands. The paper was yellowed, the creases worn soft from being folded and unfolded. I opened it carefully, spreading it flat on the table. It was covered in my grandfather's handwriting. But this wasn't the neat, measured script from his daily entries. This was rushed, uneven, the words pressed hard into the page as if he'd been shaking while he wrote. At the top, a date, August 24, 1958, the day it happened. I began to read. I don't know how to write this. I've written every day for 20 years, but I don't know how to write this. Lydia is gone. I keep saying it out loud, trying to make it real, but it doesn't feel real. It feels like something I'm watching happen to someone else, like I'll wake up tomorrow and she'll be standing in the barn, smiling, asking what I want for breakfast. But she won't be. It was an accident. I need to write that down. It was an accident. She was working late, trying to finish the threshing before the rain came. I told her to stop. I told her we could finish tomorrow. But she wanted to help. She always wanted to help. I was in the barn repairing a harness. I didn't hear anything. The machine was loud and I was too far away. By the time I came out, I can't write what I saw. I can't put it into words. She was already gone. I had to stop. The words blurred in front of me. I could feel the weight of his grief pressing through the page, decades old but still raw. I forced myself to keep reading. I went to the sheriff. I told him everything. I thought he would help. I thought he would do the right thing. But he didn't. He said it would look bad, that people already talked about us, that if this got out, they'd say I was careless, or worse, they'd say I did it on purpose. I told him that was insane. I loved her. I would never. But he said it didn't matter what the truth was. It mattered what people believed. The mayor came. The priest came. Her father came. They all said the same thing. Better to keep it quiet. Better for me. Better for the town. Better for her family. Her father took money. Enough to leave town. Enough to start over somewhere else. He didn't even look at me when he took it. Just counted the bills and left. They said I should bury her on my land, somewhere no one would find her, somewhere she could rest without anyone asking questions. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them all to go to hell. But I was afraid. Afraid of what they'd do to me. Afraid of what they'd say about her. That if the truth came out, they'd say she was careless or foolish, or that she deserved it. I couldn't let them do that to her. So I agreed. My hands were shaking now. I could barely hold the page steady. I buried her tonight, alone, under the oak tree. It's the oldest tree on the property, the strongest, the one that's weathered every storm. I thought it was fitting. She was strong too, stronger than anyone knew. I carved her name into the stone, not on top, where people could see, underneath, where only someone looking, really looking, would find it. I couldn't give her a headstone, but I couldn't leave her unmarked either, so I hid her name, a secret monument, for her, for me. The town thinks this land is cursed now. They say there's a sadness in the soil. They're right. But it's not a curse. It's grief. My grief. And it will stay here, buried deep, for as long as I live. The last line was written smaller, shakier, as if he'd barely had the strength to finish. I loved her, and I failed her. I'm sorry, Lydia. I'm so sorry. The page ended there. I sat in silence, the letter resting on the table in front of me. The house was quiet, but it felt full of ghosts, full of grief, full of truths that had been buried for too long. My grandfather hadn't been a villain.
He'd been a man in an impossible situation, broken by loss and fear, trying to protect the woman he loved the only way he knew how. He'd buried her, but he'd also remembered her. Every day for the rest of his life, he'd lived on that land knowing she was beneath it, carrying her with him in silence. The unmarked stone wasn't a curse. It was love. Quiet, broken, imperfect love. And now, finally, I understood. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the journal. Then I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the eastern field. The oak tree stood dark against the night sky, its branches reaching upward like hands in prayer. I know now, Granta. I know. And for the first time since I had arrived, the house felt at peace. Tomorrow, I would give Lydia the memorial she deserved. Tonight, I would let her rest.
I woke before dawn on the first day of spring. The house was quiet, but it felt different now, lighter, as if the weight that had pressed down on these walls for decades had finally lifted. I made coffee and sat on the porch, watching the sky turn from black to purple to pale gold. The field stretched out before me, still and peaceful, waiting for the day to begin. I'd made my decision. I was staying, not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but because this land, with all its buried secrets and silent grief, had become mine. And Lydia's story, the story my grandfather couldn't tell, deserved to be honored. After breakfast, I gathered my tools. A shovel, a rake, a pair of gardening gloves. I loaded everything into the wheelbarrow along with bags of topsoil, wildflower seeds, and a small stone marker I'd ordered from town. Eleanor had helped me with that. When I'd told her what I wanted to do, she'd cried. Then she'd made a single phone call, and within 3 days, the marker was ready. Simple, gray stone, just her name and the dates we knew. Lydia May Whitman, 1939, 1958. Remembered. I wheeled everything out to the eastern field, across the tall grass, toward the oak tree. The morning sun was warm on my back. The air smelled of earth and new growth. When I reached the grave, I stopped and set down the wheelbarrow. The stone was still there, half buried, with her name carved underneath. The grass around it had grown wild, tangled with weeds and creeping vines. It looked forgotten, abandoned, but not for much longer. I knelt and began to clear the weeds, pulling them up by the roots, working slowly and carefully. The ground was soft from recent rain and the plants came up easily. I cleared a wide circle around the stone, revealing the earth beneath, dark and rich and alive. Then I took the rake and smoothed the soil, breaking up the clumps, leveling the surface. I worked until my hands ached, until the area around the grave was clean and neat. Next, I mixed topsoil and compost, spreading it evenly over the cleared ground. The soil smelled good, earthy and fresh, like a promise. I opened the bag of wildflower seeds. They were small, delicate, a mix of colors, blues and yellows and purples, the kind that grew wild in fields like this, the kind that didn't need much care but bloomed year after year. I scattered them over the soil, working in slow circles, letting them fall where they wanted. Then I covered them lightly with more earth, patting it down gently with my hands. When I was finished, I sat back on my heels and looked at what I'd done. It wasn't much, just a small garden, but it was something. Then I unwrapped the marker. It was heavier than I expected, solid and real. I set it carefully at the head of the grave, pressing it into the soil until it stood firm and upright. The letters were carved deep, clean and clear in the morning light. Lydia May Whitman. Her name, not hidden, not whispered, but spoken aloud, in stone, for anyone who came here to see. I stood and stepped back, looking at the grave in its entirety, the cleared earth, the scattered seeds, the marker standing tall. It wasn't a curse. It had never been a curse. It was grief and love and the silence that comes when people choose fear over truth, but the silence was broken now. I heard footsteps behind me and turned. Silas stood at the edge of the field, his hat in his hands.
He looked older than I'd ever seen him, but there was something softer in his face, something like relief. He said, "I saw you come out here. Thought I'd pay my respects." I nodded. "She deserves that." Silas walked slowly to the grave and stood beside me looking down at the marker. His lips moved silently, as if he were saying something only she could hear. Then he knelt, his old knees cracking, and placed his hand on the stone. He whispered, "I'm sorry, Lydia. We all are." We stood there together for a long time, the two of us and the ghost of a girl who'd been forgotten too long. Finally, Silas stood. He looked at me, his eyes wet. He said, "You did a good thing here." I said, "It's what she deserved." He said, "Yes, it is." He put his hat back on and walked away, slow and steady, back toward his own land. I watched him go, then turned back to the grave. The oak tree stood above it, its bare branches beginning to bud with new leaves. Spring was coming. The land was waking up. And so was I. Over the next few weeks, I worked the farm. I repaired the fences, fixed the porch, cleared the barn. I planted a vegetable garden near the house and repaired the old irrigation system. And every morning, I visited Lydia's grave. I watched the wildflowers begin to sprout, tiny green shoots pushing up through the soil, reaching for the sun. By summer, they'd bloom. By autumn, they'd scatter their seeds and begin again. A cycle, a promise, a memory that wouldn't fade. The town began to change too, slowly, quietly, but it changed. Eleanor came out one afternoon with a bouquet of daisies and laid them on the grave. She didn't say anything, just knelt, set them down, and left. A few days later, a woman I didn't know stopped by. She said her grandmother had known Lydia, that she was glad someone finally remembered. Then another visitor, and another. People who had carried the secret for too long. People who wanted to say they were sorry. And one by one, they came. They stood by the oak tree. They looked at the marker. They spoke her name. Lydia May Whitman. The curse was never in the soil. It was in the silence. And the silence was broken. I stood on the porch one evening as the sun set over the fields, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The wildflowers around Lydia's grave swayed gently in the breeze, a sea of color beneath the old oak tree. The farm felt different now. It felt like home, not because the past had been erased, but because it had been honored. And in honoring it, I had found my place here. I raised my coffee cup toward the eastern field, toward the grave, toward the woman I never met, but would never forget. I said, "Rest well, Lydia." The wind carried my words across the fields.